staff reviews all of our promotional announcements for both violent and sexual content and schedules them accordingly, usually after 9 o'clock. I would also say, with respect to shows like America's Most Wanted and Cops, particularly as America's Most Wanted, we do promote that show in earlier hours, in part because we are trying to maximize the number of call-ins. This is a show, after all, that, in fact, we know the audience very well. We get 2,000 calls a week giving us tips on where a convicted felon or fugitive can be located and with possible leads. So this is a show that we do promote in a number of day parts. Having said that, the content of that promotional announcement does not typically depict any violence.
Finally, all of you heard the suggestion by Congressman Markey, one suggestion on the V kind of rating and an ability to eliminate that, and the other suggestion by Senator Dorgan that the FCC keep a scorecard and then report on that scorecard, as well as the advertisers on that, who advertises on that. I would be interested in your reaction to both ideas.
Well,
Mr. Murphy?
I think that the Congressman Markey's idea is very interesting, and I think if we have a rating system, of course, it should be privately controlled. It should not be one that is ordered by the federal government. But and you'd have to have a rating system before you would have any need for that chip he talks about. But the idea of the electronic chip, I think, is a fascinating idea which deserves a lot of attention, and I think that we would be very interested in seeing whether something like that could be possible, because I think it would make a big difference. As far as the one that, was it Senator Conrad, you said it?
Senator Dorgan.
Dorgan mentioned, I'm not so sure I would be interested in, from what I heard, in some sort of outside organization having a scorecard on this. I would like to think that we could handle our own problems responsibly.
Mr. Stringer?
Well, I think they're both worth investigating. There are a couple of obvious flaws that ought to be worth noticed, and that is that those parents, the latchkey kids, who allow their latchkey kids to sit at home, are not going to be there to program that microchip. The tougher element of society, where the sociopathic element is more obvious, are not going to be sitting there with their parents putting a chip in there. It's not going to solve that problem. I'm not against it, but responsible parents, most people in this room, children are not going to be serial killers or not going to be sociopaths, but because they're going to take care of their children, and indeed they will program those chips. But if you think about the underprivileged and the poor and the distressed and so forth, there's no one at home to do something which is fairly complicated. Most people can't program their own VCRs, much less go through 500 channels and pick out the violent shows. So it has a basic flaw. It won't solve the problem. It might help, but it doesn't aim at the most violent part of society. So yes, I'm for it, but I think there is a flaw. Similarly, on the body count, any quantitative assessment of theater or movies or any kind of creative endeavor is a difficult one. If you're doing a film about the Civil War, there'll be a very high body count, but it is a historical miniseries. Similarly, the kind of violence is more difficult to rate than the number of violence, than the amount of violence. I think that the problem in recent years for all of us has been that, starting with the movies, because they have the hardest job, but they have endeavored to be more graphic, and we have in some ways followed them. They're more and more graphic, the depiction of sex, the technical ability to portray violence, the close-ups, the Terminators and so forth have more and more disgusting violence, but the body count may not be so high. So it's a difficult thing to balance one versus the other. I think it's like everything. It's any kind of gauge. It's worth considering, but nothing is very easy in this process. And as I say, I prefer your approach, getting us all together and forcing in Hollywood a kind of consciousness raising. I mean, I put on a show that I'm not very proud of some years ago, in which a little girl used the word suck, so about her uncle, you suck. And afterwards, I got called by the producer of that and said, thank you for letting that on. And I said, actually, why are you thanking me for letting it on? He said, well, it's a signal to the production community in Hollywood that you mean business, that you're going to expand the envelope and give creative programmers their head. And I said, it was disgusting. And your viewers are going away, and if that's the kind of execution that you're responsible for, we'll all be out of business. But there is a sort of mythology out there that if you keep pushing the envelope, and that's the reason why from the 50s to 60s and 70s and 80s, that violence is more gratuitous and graphic and technically more adept. And that's the clock that has to be turned back. And we have started to drop the body count. For instance, the blood packs that you see in movies where a bullet is hit and unrealistically blood spurts halfway across the room. I mean, that's a movie feature designed to bring young audiences in. Yes, that they can be shown on cable, but we have 30 people in standards and practices who would cut out all those elements. I don't mean to waffle on, but it's a slightly complicated issue, and I'm for the chip, but some of it won't solve the problems because they are rather more complicated. In the end, it is up to the people who put the programs on the air, make them, and people like us to do something about the nature of the programming to make it either more wholesome or more thoughtful or more artistic.
Mr. Littlefield.
Yes, we believe on a voluntary basis we can be responsible broadcasters. I think as Mr. Stringer was just saying, there are many, many problems with some of the proposed plans. I know if my 8-year-old son sees that a feature film is PG, or if it's even R, that's far more interesting to him than a general audience. It's because you're not supposed to be there. You're not supposed to touch. You're not supposed to be looking. It makes it all the more intriguing. And that's why I believe that we can come to broadcasting with a renewed sense of the problem with violence in television, and I feel we can be far more effective if we do this on a volunteer basis.
Mr. Vandenberg.
I am, too, intrigued by the notion of a chip in the television set. In many of the high-end sets today, that capability exists to be able to block out any particular program or particular channel. With respect to the ratings, I think that there's an enormous attraction, theoretically, to anything that gives more information to parents in order to be able to permit them to supervise their children. I do not think, however, in this instance that ratings will prove to be such a benefit, and I do think they carry some additional risks. The benefits, I think, are not there because I think most parents do know what is on television. I think when they turn into a TV series like America's Most Wanted, they know the nature of that program. They don't need a rating with respect to that program. They can make their own judgment, and many parents will make quite different judgments as to whether their children ought to be watching that program, and it will very often depend on the circumstance. Is the parent going to be there to watch with the child or not? So I do think that parents are going to make a lot of different choices, and I don't think they need additional information because I do think they know most of the time the nature of the programming that's on. I do share Mr. Littlefield's concern that, in fact, ratings can be attractive as well, and therefore when something is like rated with a V or rated with a V100, that in fact, if they can't get it on their own TV set, they're going to find a neighbor whose parents have made a different choice, and they're going to go try and find out that show to see what it is that their parent is trying to prevent them from watching. TV is very accessible. Finally, I think there are real definition problems. I take it that Congressman Markey was suggesting a single rating, either V or no V. And if you look at Dr. Gerbner's studies of what the violent programming in this society is, over 50% of the sitcoms he would classify as violent. He would classify as the most violent genre in the week-long sample that he studied was TV's funniest commercials and the 25th anniversary of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. That's what he would characterize on his study as the most violent genre on television in the sample week that he studied. I think as a consequence, when you look at a rating system, whether it's strictly a V rating system or whether it's a V0 to 100, which Dr. Centerwall was talking about, even in that instance, V100, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In is going to get a V100 rating. I think you've taken away some of the context, you've taken away some of the subtlety, and in the end, I do think you're taking away some of the criteria that I think parents would judge based upon their knowledge and their judgment about what television shows are as to what their children would watch. So I think there are little benefit, and I think there are some risks in this as well as enormous definitional problems.
Senator Metzenbaum.
I don't know that I have any questions, Mr. Chairman, but I will say this, that as I sit here, I realize the difficult challenge that these gentlemen face in the networks that they represent, because no one of them alone.
Mr. Stringer mentioned that television violence is not the sole cause of violence in our society. No one here suggests this. You're looking at 3 senators who are trying to discourage the proliferation of weapons in our society. But I think the industry has to recognize that it is a cause of violence in our society, that violence in our society is made up of a mosaic. And part of that mosaic is violence on television. When you say that you've had more discussions this past year on violence on television than in the previous 22 years in the business, that frankly encourages me. I think we have, the message has to be to you today, this is a serious problem in the minds of those of us in Congress. I think Senator Metzenbaum summed it up very well. We appreciate your being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Children's programming, the positive things really can catch on. I look at my granddaughter's fascination with Barney. You may not know who Barney is, Senator Feinstein, but I'll tell you. I'll even sing the Barney song to you one of these days. But it suggests that we can do positive things. I want to enter into the record a statement from Senator Hatch, who was unable to be here today. Cable has done some very positive things. C-SPAN clearly has been a major contribution to our country. You have a good crew working for you here, for your industry here in Washington, headed by Jim Mooney, highly respected. But I would be less than candid at saying there is another side in the perception of many people here in the amount of violence. And occasionally, my wife and I will catch some show on cable that really, you know, it goes so beyond the good taste, and you know it has to have an adverse effect. You mentioned, Mr. Sassa, you say there is a limit to what one company acting alone can achieve without suffering competitive damage. Is there any way of getting the cable industry, and I recognize when you talk about the cable industry, you're talking about huge quantities of entities, but the giants, the 3 of you represent them. And let me pay tribute to Ted Turner, one of the first to come on board to support my exemption of the antitrust laws on this question of violence. Is there some way to get the cable industry together to say, we're going to adopt some standards just as broadcasters now have? Mr. Biondi?
Well, there are forums that exist, and then the gathering in Los Angeles in August is an ideal place to do it. I think the deal with the industry as a whole in one set of standards is probably going to be problematic simply because the access, for example, to an HBO or Showtime or a Playboy is by its nature restricted. And what we play on those networks are contractually essentially feature films within the ratings boundaries that I indicated. And we're contractually obliged to play them that unedited and in those forms that they were exhibited as features. As you've heard from many of the witnesses here, feature films have their own set of dynamics with respect to violence. I don't think you'll have a major problem in getting agreement on the fact that there is a problem. I think Howard Stringer illustrated many of the issues that are not relevant to cable or broadcast specifically, but relevant to the issues of how do you deal with violence in the context of programming and deal with it responsibly. There are pressures on you from the creative community. There are obviously very substantial pressures for a cable network from its audience, because our audience can, in fact, disconnect every month. So there's substantial commercial pressures to keep your audience pleased with your product. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I mean, you mentioned C-SPAN, but you come to mind Nickelodeon, Discovery, Arts and Entertainment, ESPN, I mentioned Arts and Entertainment, the Discovery Channel. I mean, those are, for all intents and purposes, the most benign, in a sense of violence, programming services that you can imagine. And they came simply out of the cable industry. The ideas were there, they were available, they were developed by cable. So the answer is, as you can tell, a little bit less than direct, because I don't think you can give an answer that would probably be as satisfactory as you might like in this hearing. But from an intellectual and business perspective, it's really hard to get your hands around as diverse a group of programs that range from a Nickelodeon to a Playboy in terms of content at their extremes.
But it seems to me that Nickelodeon to Playboy, while you might not agree on standards on explicit sex and some other things like that, on violence, it does seem to me there ought to be some ability to get together. And you have a limited time, as Senator Metzenbaum pointed out. This exemption of the antitrust law expires December 1st. And I'm sure it is no secret to your industry you lost a major battle here last year. The major reason was because of the pricing factor. Some local stations took advantage of their pricing opportunities and their monopolies. But another factor, not as significant a factor, was the violence factor, that it had not created a lot of goodwill here in Congress. Let me just mention the Congressional Quarterly Researcher says, a 1992 study by the Washington-based Center for Media and Public Affairs found more violence on MTV, one of your outlets, than on the three major TV networks combined. There is a problem in cable. I don't think we can deny it. USA, here's from the Washington Post. This is 10:30 on a Saturday morning. A lot of children watching. A Nightmare on Elm Street, which my staff tells me is a very gory kind of a movie. There is a problem on cable, and somehow we ought to be able to solve that problem without the heavy hand of government coming down and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that. I would like to see this industry get together in the next few months to really see if a better job can't be done. I picked on Mr. Biondi here, but if any responses, any reaction, Mr. Kennan and Mr. Sassa.
Well, I think this is a very complicated issue, and certainly from our company's point of view, we've made the efforts, but cable represents a diverse group of programmers, and we've actually had some meetings to try to put things together, and are very interested in doing this, but perhaps the plan that Representative Markey has suggested is a good way to go, or some type of reporting system, as I don't remember the other senator's name, Dornan has proposed is something that I know our company would endorse fully.
I think the steps of raising the consciousness on the part of the cable programmers are a great first step, and I think it is incumbent on us to push this forward. I don't know the exact steps, but I certainly think this level of consciousness and public spotlight is a first step.
The difficulty is we don't have a lot of time to make additional steps. And I really think it is important for you and representatives of Time Warner and the other biggies in the industry to get together and say, can't we do something to police ourselves rather than having Congress come in and do something? I I would ask you to discuss this among yourselves, get together with Jim Mooney, get together with the other CEOs, and see if we can't do a better job than I sense is we're heading toward now. And even Mr. Sassa, even though Turner has done a good job, when you talk about action movies, we're talking about violent movies usually. Now, and we ought to be able to establish some standards here, it seems to me. Senator Feinstein.
Mr. Chairman, I was unsure of the response to your...
The meeting?
Yes.
We're all for it from our company's point of view.
We're participating also in these various meetings and sub-meetings and the August anti-violence on television meeting. So I think we're participating too.
Yeah, I mean, there are ongoing efforts, as I tried to say. It's just not easy, and I appreciate the constraints of time and the concerns of the committee.
May I ask Mr. Boyandi, when is the next meeting?
You know, I don't sit on the committee per se, but David may know or Scott.
Well, the last meeting we had was in New York, and there were members of HB
who replaced a worker in Patterson, New Jersey, who had worked for 33 years and had finally moved into a modest 6-room house. This is what we